January 21st, 1968. Dawn breaks over the fog-choked valleys of northwestern Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. 6,000 United States Marines peer through the mist from their combat base at Khe Sanh, a remote outpost perched just 10 miles from the Laotian border. They are surrounded. 20,000 North Vietnamese Army troops have encircled their position, cutting every supply line, every escape route. What follows is not merely a battle, it is a 77-day siege that will echo the horrors of their done, a crucible of fire, fear, and unimaginable endurance. The ground trembles. Artillery shells scream overhead. Explosions walk across the red earth like the footsteps of giants, spewing smoke, dirt, and death into the fog. In bunkers dug deep into the hillsides, Marines huddle beneath sandbags and timber, listening to the symphony of destruction above. They know one truth: no one can get in, no one can get out. They will survive only if the skies remain open, if the transport planes and helicopters can thread the needle through walls of anti-aircraft fire to drop food, ammunition, water, and hope. This is Khe Sanh, a place where survival is measured not in victories, but in heartbeats between explosions, where courage is forged in the dirt and the dark, where the question is not if the enemy will attack, but when. To understand why Khe Sanh became the focal point of one of the Vietnam War's most ferocious struggles, we must rewind to 1967, a year when American strategy hinged on containment, attrition, and the controversial belief that superior firepower could break the enemy's will. Khe Sanh Combat Base sat in the northwest corner of South Vietnam, nestled among rugged mountains and triple canopy jungle. Its location was both strategic and precarious. The base monitored North Vietnamese infiltration routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeblood of communist logistics snaking through Laos and into South Vietnam. It served as the western anchor of the McNamara Line, also called the Strong Point Obstacle System, a network of sensors, minefields, and fortifications designed to detect and disrupt enemy movement. But Khe Sanh was more than a tripwire. It was a symbol. By early 1968, the war had grown deeply unpopular at home. Every inch of ground conceded to the Communists became front-page news, fueling protests and eroding public support. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, understood this reality. He saw Khe Sanh as an opportunity, a chance to lure North Vietnamese forces into a decisive engagement where American air power and artillery could annihilate them at ratios of 10-1, even 30-1. President Lyndon Johnson shared Westmoreland's obsession. A model of Khe Sanh reportedly sat in the White House Situation Room, a constant reminder of what was at stake.
Chúng ta phải tấn công điểm cao gần Khe Sanh.
On the other side of the wire, the North Vietnamese had their own calculus. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of Dien Bien Phu's legendary victory over the French in 1954, saw parallels at Khe Sanh. Like Dien Bien Phu, Khe Sanh was isolated, surrounded by high ground, and dependent on aerial resupply. Giap massed artillery in the surrounding hills, 122 millimeters, 130 millimeters, and 152 millimeter guns, weapons never before used in the Vietnam War. His plan was simple: bombard the Marines into submission, then assault and overrun the base. A victory at Khe Sanh would shatter American morale and prove that even the mightiest military could be defeated. The defenders of Khe Sanh were primarily Marines of the 26th Marine Regiment, reinforced by artillery batteries, special forces units, and South Vietnamese Rangers. They occupied not just the main combat base, but also a constellation of hilltop outposts with names that would become legendary. Hill 881 South, Hill 881 North, Hill 861, and Hill 861 Alpha. These hills were the high ground, critical for observation and fire support. Losing them would mean the base itself became untenable. Life at Khe Sanh before the siege was already harsh. Constant patrols through dense jungle, sporadic firefights with North Vietnamese scouts, the ever-present threat of ambush. But nothing could prepare the Marines for what was coming, a siege that would test not just their training and equipment, but their very humanity. On January 20, 1968, a North Vietnamese lieutenant deserted and surrendered to the Marines. Under interrogation, he revealed a chilling secret. A massive attack was imminent. Hours later, the bombardment began.
At 12:30 a.m. on January 21, 1968, the night exploded. North Vietnamese artillery and rockets tore through the darkness, slamming into Khe Sanh combat base with devastating accuracy. The main ammunition dump, stacked high with artillery shells, mortar rounds, and explosives, erupted in a cataclysmic fireball. Secondary explosions rippled across the base for hours, turning night into day, and consuming nearly half of the Marines' artillery ammunition in a single stroke. Marines scrambled from their tents and hooches, diving into trenches as shrapnel and debris rained down. The earth shook. The air became unbreathable, thick with smoke, cordite, and burning fuel. Men shouted over the roar, calling out for medics, for ammunition, for God. In minutes, the base transformed from a fortified position into a hellscape. But the bombardment was only the beginning. As dawn broke on January 21st, North Vietnamese infantry launched coordinated assaults on Khe Sanh village and Hill 861. The village fell within hours. On Hill 861, Marines fought desperately to hold the high ground, calling in artillery and airstrikes danger close as enemy soldiers swarmed the slopes. They held, but barely. Over the next 48 hours, the pattern became clear. This was not a raid. This was a siege. North Vietnamese forces had encircled Khe Sanh, severing Route 9, the only road linking the base to the outside world. No convoys could get through. No reinforcements could arrive by land. The Marines were trapped. Colonel David Lones, commander of the 26th Marine Regiment, assessed the situation with grim clarity. His 6,000 Marines faced an estimated 20,000 North Vietnamese troops dug into the hills and jungle around the base. Enemy artillery, hidden in caves and camouflage positions across the border in Laos, could strike at will. The only lifeline was the sky. Lowndes ordered his men to dig deeper. Every Marine became an engineer, excavating bunkers and trenches, reinforcing positions with sandbags, timbers, and scavenged metal. They moved underground, transforming Khe Sanh into a subterranean fortress where survival depended on staying below ground level. Above, the base became a moonscape, cratered, scorched, and littered with twisted metal. On January 21st, the North Vietnamese fired their opening salvo in what would become a 77-day artillery duel. Between January and April, enemy gunners launched 243 separate fire missions, expending over 11,900 artillery shells, rockets, and mortar rounds. The record for a single day was 1,307 shells on February 23rd. By March, the average was 150 shells per day. The siege of Khe Sanh had begun, and for the Marines trapped inside, time would be measured not in days or weeks, but in explosions, helicopter landings, and the agonizing wait for resupply. Survival at Khe Sanh demanded more than courage. It required adaptation,
ingenuity, and an almost inhuman tolerance for fear. Within days of the siege's start, Marines developed what they called the Khe Sanh shuffle, a cover-run duck technique perfected under fire. They learned to read the rhythm of enemy bombardments. Morning fog meant temporary reprieve. When the fog burned off, the shelling began. Men moved between bunkers in short, desperate sprints, zigzagging, diving, scrambling, always listening for the telltale whistle of incoming rounds. Seconds meant the difference between life and death. Lance Corporal Ron Eccles, serving with Company I on Hill 881 South, remembered the ritual with dark humor. As soon as the fog burned up, they would start hitting us with mortars and artillery. If there was daylight, we would get hit, he recalled. Every morning, the company raised the American flag, a defiant ceremony that inevitably drew enemy fire. As soon as the last note of the bugle sounded, Marines vanished into trenches and bunkers while explosions erupted overhead. Then, as the smoke cleared, someone would raise Maggie's draws, a pole adorned with red silk panties to mock the enemy's poor aim. It was gallows humor, but it kept men sane. The siege transformed Khe Sanh into the most dangerous airstrip in the world. With ground resupply impossible, everything depended on aircraft. Food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, replacements, and hope. The Air Force and Marine Corps launched one of history's most intense aerial resupply operations. C-130 Hercules transports became the workhorses of the siege, flying into Khe Sanh's 3,900-foot runway under constant fire. Pilots approached at maximum speed, touched down just long enough to offload cargo, often with engines still running, then roared back into the sky. The entire process took minutes, sometimes seconds. Over the 77 days, Allied aircraft flew 26,658 sorties over Khe Sanh, delivering supplies and dropping an estimated 98,721 tons of munitions on enemy positions. But the cost was staggering. North Vietnamese anti-aircraft guns lined the approach routes, filling the sky with tracers and explosions. 17 helicopters were shot down during the siege. Another 35 were badly damaged. Transport planes limped back to base riddled with bullet holes.
The Air Force experimented with desperate measures. LAPS, Low-Altitude Parachute Extraction System, allowed planes to drop cargo pallets at extremely low altitude without landing. The first attempt was catastrophic. A parachute malfunctioned, and the skidding pallet crashed into a medical station, killing 3 Marines. 3 weeks later, another off-target delivery killed 1 Marine when it struck a bunker. The Air Force switched to GPS, Ground Proximity Extraction System, which used a hook to snag a ground cable, yanking cargo out the back of the plane like a carrier landing. Of 15 GPS deliveries, 2 malfunctioned. Ultimately, airdrops became the safest method. 600 drops made during the siege, 90% by C-130s, with only a 3% malfunction rate. The hilltop outposts, 881 South, 881 North, 861, and 861 Alpha, endured even harsher conditions than the main base. These positions, perched on barren peaks, could only be resupplied by helicopter. For the first 30 days, resupply attempts were near suicidal. 7 helicopters got shot down bringing supplies into us, Eccles remembered. We went 9 days one time without anything to eat. Water became critical. With no natural sources and helicopters unable to land, Marines improvised. During the thick morning fog, they spread plastic sheets down the hillsides to capture condensation, precious drops of water wrung from the mist. It was survival at its most elemental. By late February, Marine aviators developed the Super Gaggle, a coordinated assault resupply tactic.
12 A-4 Skyhawk fighter bombers suppressed enemy anti-aircraft positions, while 12 to 16 helicopters descended simultaneously on the hilltop outposts, hovering for as little as 19 seconds to deliver supplies. The Super Gaggle became the turning point in the resupply effort. In February, Marine helicopters delivered 465 tons of supplies. By March, with better weather, the total reached 40 tons per day. Beneath the tactical challenges lay a deeper struggle, the war of the mind. North Vietnamese psychological operations included leaflets promising safe passage if Marines surrendered, broadcasts from Hanoi Hana mocking American losses, and the relentless, grinding artillery fire designed to break morale. Marines countered with dark humor and stubborn defiance. They named bunkers after hometowns, girlfriends, and bars back in the States. They wrote letters home, though mail service was sporadic. They sang, told jokes, and clung to routines, anything to maintain a sense of normalcy in the chaos. February 1968 marked the siege's deadliest phase. On February 5th, North Vietnamese forces launched a 4-hour bombardment followed by a major assault on Hill 861 Alpha. The next day, they attacked Hill 881 South. On February 7th, NVA tanks, another first in the war, overran the Lang Vây Special Forces camp just southwest of Khe Sanh. On February 23rd, the North Vietnamese unleashed their heaviest bombardment, 1,307 shells in one day. But the Marines held. They held through the fog and the fire, through hunger and fear, through the endless nights when sleep was impossible and every sound might be the prelude to an assault. They held because surrender was unthinkable and retreat was impossible.
By early March 1968, Khe Sanh had become an international obsession. President Johnson demanded hourly updates. The American media drew constant comparisons to Dien Bien Phu, where the French had suffered catastrophic defeat. But unknown to the world, the tide was turning. As early as late January, General Westmoreland had ordered contingency plans for Khe Sanh's relief. By early March, with Tet's initial shock subsiding, attention returned to the besieged Marines. Major General John J. Tolson, commander of the 1st Air Cavalry Division, unveiled Operation Pegasus, a bold, multi-division relief effort combining the 1st Air Cavalry Division, the 3rd Marine Division, and the 3rd ARVN Airborne Task Force in a coordinated push to reopen Route 9 and break the siege. On April 1, 1968, Operation Pegasus launched. Helicopters lifted thousands of air cavalry troopers into landing zones around Khe Sanh, while engineers and infantry fought to clear Route 9. Inside Khe Sanh, the Marines went on the offensive. On April 4th, they broke out from their defensive positions, pushing into the surrounding hills to link up with the advancing relief columns. Artillery and airstrikes pulverized North Vietnamese bunkers and trench systems. On April 8, 1968, elements of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry reached Khe Sanh Combat Base. The siege was officially broken. Route 9 was declared fully open on April 11th. Operation Pegasus concluded on April 15th, and the 1st Marine Regiment relieved the exhausted 26th Marines. Over the 77-day siege, more than 10,000 soldiers, Vietnamese and American, died in the fighting. Official U.S. casualty figures place American deaths at approximately 500 to 700, with thousands more wounded. North Vietnamese losses were catastrophic, estimated between 10,000 and 15,000 killed under the relentless aerial bombardment. For the Marines who survived, the relief brought mixed emotions. They had endured the unendurable. They had held against overwhelming odds. But many wondered, was it worth it? 60 days after the siege ended, on July 5, 1968, the U.S. military abandoned Khe Sanh Combat Base. The hills were evacuated, the bunkers demolished, the airstrip destroyed.
The American media erupted with questions. If Khe Sanh was so vital in January, why abandon it in July? What had changed? The North Vietnamese claimed victory, announcing they had liberated Khe Sanh on July 15th. They controlled the ground. They controlled the narrative.
The siege of Khe Sanh left scars far deeper than the cratered hills of northwestern Quang Tri province. It reshaped military doctrine, fueled political debates, and became a symbol of the Vietnam War's ambiguities and costs. For the U.S. military, Khe Sanh demonstrated both the power and limitations of air power. Over 26,658 sorties delivered supplies and dropped nearly 100,000 tons of munitions, an average of 1,300 tons per day. The siege validated the super Gaggle concept of coordinated helicopter resupply under fighter escort, which became doctrine in future conflicts. But Khe Sanh also exposed the dangers of static defense in counterinsurgency warfare. By concentrating forces in a remote fixed position, the U.S. ceded mobility. The decision to abandon the base underscored a painful lesson. Holding ground for symbolic reasons rarely translates to strategic victory. The siege became a flashpoint in American political discourse. President Johnson's obsession with Khe Sanh symbolized his administration's fixation on tactical victories over strategic coherence. The parallels drawn to Dien Bien Phu haunted the American psyche. Though the Marines successfully defended Khe Sanh, the ultimate abandonment of the base reinforced public doubts about the war's purpose and prospects. For Vietnam veterans, Khe Sanh occupies a unique place in memory. It represents both the best and worst of the American experience in Vietnam, extraordinary courage and endurance, undermined by strategic confusion and political cynicism. Survivors like Ron Eccles have become keepers of the siege's history, speaking at schools and veterans events to ensure the sacrifices are not forgotten. 77 days. 77 days of fire and fear, of courage and doubt, of survival against impossible odds. The siege of Khe Sanh was not a single battle, but a test of human endurance, a crucible where 6,000 Marines faced 20,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, where the sky was the only lifeline, and where holding the line meant refusing to break. Was Khe Sanh a victory? The answer depends on how you measure success. The Marines held the base. They survived. They inflicted devastating losses on the enemy. But the base was abandoned weeks later, and the war dragged on for 7 more years. Perhaps the true legacy of Khe Sanh is not found in strategic assessments or casualty statistics, but in the resilience of the men who endured it. They held not because the ground was valuable, but because their brothers depended on them. They held because surrender was unthinkable and retreat was impossible. They held because, in the end, that was all they could do. Today, the hills of Khe Sanh are quiet. Grass and jungle have reclaimed the bunkers and trenches. The airstrip, where C-130s once roared under fire, is silent. But the memory endures. In the names on the wall in Washington, in the stories told by aging veterans, and in the lessons learned at such terrible cost. Khe Sanh was a modern-day Verdun, a siege where survival became victory, and where the line between heroism and futility blurred in the smoke and chaos of war. And like Verdun, its true meaning may never be fully understood, only remembered and honored.